Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this evening's seminar on the question of what improvements a Labour government, which we'll assume comes into power in 2023-2024, could realistically hope to obtain from the EU in the trade and cooperation agreement. And particular congratulations to everyone who's forsworn the wonderful weather and whatever football is on at the moment to join us. And we have a great panel to talk to us this evening. So Jonathan Fall was for many years a very senior official at the European Commission and was heavily involved in the negotiations between the EU and David Cameron's government before the EU referendum. Anna Jarzewska is a leading expert on customs issues and on the problems now being faced by British exporters, and is an absolute must follow on Twitter if you're interested in those sort of issues. Raoul Leparel is also another must follow on Twitter. He was a leading figure in the negotiations between the Theresa May government and the EU, working on the British side, and is now a commentator on EU and trade issues. And last but not least, Luke Cooper is a lecturer at the London School of Economics and the author of a recent paper produced by Another Europe is Possible on the topic that we're discussing this evening. And again, another a person who you should follow on Twitter. Having introduced everyone, next thing to say is that I encourage everyone who wants to ask questions in the Q&A box. That would be great, and I'm sure there will be questions. But I'm going to start by asking Raoul Leparel really to sort of comment on the overall question that we're discussing this evening. Let's assume that we have in 2025, the time when the TCA comes up for review, a Labour government. Let's also assume that it's not a Labour government that's in a position immediately to apply to rejoin the EU or to join the EEA, but has promised in its manifesto that it will try and improve the terms of trade for UK exporters and UK individuals wanting to do business with or live in the EU. What sorts of things do you think it could realistically ask for?
George, so I think it's obviously very hypothetical, so I'll base it on my experience of negotiations and what the EU might have been willing to agree or discuss, but what exactly the situation would be if this came to pass, who knows. But just to start, I think there are a few different areas where there could be some improvements, but I think the general rule of thumb is if you want to see big changes, there will have to be big policy shifts. I think if you start with services, there is a potential to do a slightly better deal on mutual recognition of professional qualifications. The TCA does allow for that. UK ask, obviously, during the negotiations so far has been pretty ambitious. So the EU has taken a pretty basic line on that in terms of what it's done in other free trade agreements. But I think over time, there may be scope to improve that. I think more broadly on services, a more open approach to immigration could see slightly better terms, mobility and mode 4 terms in the agreement, especially around things like music and creative sectors, as we've seen discussed in the press, but also I think in terms of the time allowed for people to move to provide services and maybe a bit more flexibility about the type of services they can provide. But I think unless you're accepting free movement of people fully, I think the scope for improvements in the services space is fairly limited. You may be able to chip away at some of the reservations that are in there, and there's a long list of reservations that member states have on different sectors. But I think without free movement of people, the progress is going to be fairly limited. And part of that's to do with the Swiss precedent, where obviously they accept free movement of people, but don't really have anything on services. So I think for that reason, without a very significant change in approach, the services scope for improvement in services is probably pretty limited. Financial services is I guess, a specific point. I think commitment to align with financial services rules definitely could generate positive equivalence decisions where they're able to do so. But I don't think we'll see a replication of passporting that we had before, or sort of membership of the single market in financial services. I think the EU has made a sort of strategic decision here that it doesn't want its financial centres to be outside of the EU, and therefore, even with alignment in these areas, you're not going to get back to sort of passporting style arrangements, I wouldn't have thought. I think on goods, the obvious area is a sanitary and phytosanitary deal being discussed a lot in reference to Northern Ireland at the moment. But I think alignment with EU rules in this area would significantly lower the burden on business when it comes to agri-food trade between two sides, and would ease challenges at the border. But I think beyond this area, even aligning in different sectors isn't guaranteed to generate much difference. Obviously, if you think back to the checkers approach that they put on the table, it was basically aligning with all of the goods regulations that the EU has. And that wasn't enough to generate, much movement on the EU side. They still weren't willing to promise things like membership of EU agencies such as the Medicines Agency, Chemicals Agency, or EASA, the Aviation Agency. So I think even there, you can do bits of improvement, but alignment doesn't necessarily guarantee that. Even in that case, I think the best hope there would be EASA, where the EU has been a bit more forward-leaning. They've offered sort of some elements of mutual recognition in the TCA on aviation. So I think there is possibility for a deeper relationship with EASA. Things like broader mutual recognition agreements, I think, are likely to come down the track anyway, and so those could be done. The EU has done them with other countries, but again, they don't replicate the sort of mutual recognition you get inside the EU. And then just finally, I think on security, one area that is an area where there could be progress, particularly if there's shift on the role of the European Court of Justice or an EFTA court style arrangement. I think that would open up probably the ability to get greater access to some of the EU tools and databases, because fundamentally a lot of it is about the oversight of how this data is used when it's shared, and so having a role for the ECJ and the oversight of EU citizens' data there, I think would make a difference. Again, there may be some limits if you're not accepting free movement of people, and that was something sort of made consistently during the negotiations to the Theresa May government in terms of the depth of the security relationship. I think a stronger commitment to the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the Court of Human Rights might help as well. There's always been a bit of a sense that the government is going to walk away from that, and that I think has obviously caused some concern on the EU side. So I think there is definitely scope to deepen the security relationship in that sense. But again, it would require probably some alignment of rules and oversight of the Court of Justice to achieve that. And obviously those are quite big policy shifts from where we are now. And I guess finally, obviously, we're assuming that this is sort of the starting point is where we are now. Given the way things are going, it's certainly possible the relationship deteriorates further, and therefore the basis to build on is worse than it is now, and the relationship is more distant. So, there's lots of things that could change before that date. But I'll leave it there. I think you're on mute, George.
I need to unmute. Thank you very much, Raoul. If I can sort of pass over to Sir Jonathan Fall. Actually, I was going to, no, I think I'll pass over to Anna next, actually, to deal with specifically her area of expertise, which is sort of customs and customs issues at the border. I mean, Anna, short of joining the EEA, the EU, or a full customs union, what do you think might be realistic things that the UK could ask the EU for, which would deal with some of these problems that UK exporters are experiencing at the Dover-Calais border, and of course, depending on what happens with the protocol, the Stranraer-Larne non-border?
Yeah, it's a big question. I think Raoul mentioned one very important, I mean, many very important points, but one in particular that I would echo is that a lot of these areas, the question isn't about technical solutions, it's about political shifts. So as Raoul mentioned, you can't have significant changes in circumstances without significant changes in terms of policy. So in areas that concern goods, such as mutual recognition of conformity assessments or SPS equivalence versus recognition and so on, it's not a technical question. We'll need to see where we are in 5 years' time in terms of political will and the type of relationship that we have. In terms of borders and customs, I think one caveat here is that if you're not currently speaking to companies, as I know many people are speaking to companies, to logistics provider, and so on, but if you aren't, it's sometimes difficult to grasp just how profound the impact that this new customs and regulatory border has on many companies. Especially, we've talked a lot about rules of origin in the last 6 months, but something like rules of origin really is, kind of a question of whether some businesses will continue to function. So just as an example, I spent all day today working with one of my clients who's an SME, trying to reclassify one of their products under a different commodity code because the rule of origin for the commodity code that they're currently using, they cannot meet that rule of origin. So the only option for us, and they cannot change the supply chain because it doesn't depend on them. So the only option for us is to reclassify, obviously within the scope of existing rules. And it's not my first client, or not the first client in the last 6 months who told me, basically, if you don't find a solution, I no longer have a business. That's it. Like, this is the tariffs. The tariffs in this case are 16%. That's not the amount of cost that companies can absorb in many cases, especially if they're SMEs. So for this particular discussion, I think the important point is that in 5 years' time, a lot of this would have, kind of been done. Like, a lot of the supply chains would have shifted. A lot of the companies that are currently trading will not be trading in 5 years' time because of these barriers. So I think that's the first caveat, is that the supply chains that formed under the EU, when the UK was in the EU over the last decades, in the next 5 years will continue to unbundle, and in 5 years' time, the benefits of what we had until January, if you introduce some of these facilitations, will not lead to the same benefit just because the supply chains won't be there as the kind of base. They might start forming, but I think that's an important perspective to keep in mind. In terms of specific things that we could ask for, that the UK could ask for, obviously the elephant in the room is the third-party accumulation, the extended accumulation. The fact that at the moment, if you and I have, it's still counterintuitive for a number of clients, and I keep having to explain this to companies that yes, the UK and the EU both have an agreement with South Korea, but it doesn't mean that if you bring something to the EU and then bring that product to the UK, you can trade tariff-free. That's something that the EU has been very reluctant to give to anyone, probably because if they give it to one person, the chances are, to one country, the one partner, the chances are they'll have to implement it in other trade agreements as well. However, on the plus side, one of the arguments that the EU used to kind of highlight when talking about third-party accumulation was the fact that we're not sure whether it's WTO compliant. We're not sure whether there'll be any protests. Apologies, that's my apologies for that. And so far, the EU implemented cross-party accumulation in its rollover agreements in many of these agreements, and we've not seen any complaints, and it's working more or less fine. So I still think the EU would be reluctant, but there is an option there. There are a number of smaller provisions under the TCA that could be improved, anything to do with insufficient processing. So this fact that if you bring a product from the EU that originates in the EU into the UK, and you repackage it and you're sending it back to the EU, you are faced with full tariffs. The list of processes that are considered insufficient. Anything to do for goods that are sent for repair. In the TCA itself, there's a provision, I think it's Article 8 of the Origin Chapter, that says that parties will not charge tariffs for goods that are going back and forth for the purpose of being repaired. However, and that's also a very good example of how the text of a trade agreement differs from customs practice and how customs is applied. In practice, in order to kind of send goods for repair, you need to apply for inward and outward processing, which is a customs procedure. And that's, it's doable, it works fine, but it requires jumping through additional hoops. It requires submitting additional applications, additional paperwork, and as a customs procedure, if you're not compliant, if you don't meet all the conditions, you can get into trouble just by not discharging your goods from these procedures properly. So goods for repair, insufficient processing, accumulation, simplification of rules of origin in some cases, that's definitely very important. And then in terms of the border itself, how you manage the border, the checks and procedures, the problem here is that on one hand, there's a lot that can be done, but unilaterally. So there's a lot that can be done on the UK side to improve the functioning of our borders by, for example, raising awareness, educating traders, monitoring what customs brokers are doing. The level of non-compliance at the moment is shocking, both in terms of what companies are doing and in terms of what customs brokers and logistics providers are doing. I mean, it's just the level of compliance is close to zero at this point. It's just the stories that you hear on a daily basis, that we shouldn't be in that position. However, there are some perhaps slightly far-fetched initiatives. So in the first draft, in the UK proposal for the trade agreement with the EU, the initial proposal, I don't remember exactly what was published, but the first proposal that the UK issued, there was under the customs chapter, there was a proposal for a pilot to start working on something similar to what Norway has on its border, meaning single customs offices. A deeper cooperation in terms of customs, whereby if you have a transaction between the EU and the UK, that transaction would only go through customs once. It would be a joint office whereby exports and imports happen at the same time. And that obviously would be a massive simplification. It is a bit far out there. I mean, the EU doesn't have that with Switzerland. The only country where we have that is Norway. However, that would be incredibly helpful. I mean, if you're talking about things that if there was a will, and as Raul said, if there was a positive relationship in terms of kind of the Northern Ireland Protocol and all the other smaller issues, if they were perhaps addressed at this point, yes, there would be scope to do something like that, and that would be beneficial. That would definitely change the difficulty that the traders are facing and limit the cost significantly, because you only have one process instead of two. But other than that, we do have a customs and regulatory border. There are certain limitations, and if we keep the current relationship, a free trade deal, the only thing you can do is kind of smooth the edges, but you can't really significantly change the shape of what happens at the border. So I'll stop here.
Thank you, Anna. That was excellent. So Jonathan, looking at this from the perspective of Brussels, you've heard what sort of suggestions that Raul and Anna have made. Do you have any comments on those, and what do you think the EU's position in relation to the sorts of things that Raul and Anna have been discussing would be likely to be? Again, assuming that we've got a different government, but a government that is interested in a closer relationship with the EU, but not in customs union or EEA type membership.
Well, it depends on many things. It depends how bad. It depends what the Northern Ireland Assembly installment has voted on the continuation or not of the Northern Ireland Protocol. If that falls in Belfast, there will be a crisis, and a new government will be picking up a lot of pieces. It depends on how quickly the COVID crisis is resolved, what the inevitable inquiries in London, in Brussels, in every individual European country say about who got it right, who got it wrong, whose fault was it, that things happened the way they did, and what public opinion of that. And of course, at least in 2024, there will be a new leadership in the European institutions in Brussels. There will be certainly a new German chancellor who will have been in office for a while by then. There could be a new French president, and if it's anybody other than Emmanuel Macron, that it's a completely different situation, particularly if it's Marine Le Pen. Is the United Kingdom still in the shape we all know and love today? What's happened in Scotland? What's happened at the border between Gibraltar and Spain? And I suppose, above all, what the respective economies look like. Who is seen to have done better or worse? And who comes as a supplicant for change? Who thinks that change is really necessary? What trade agreements has each side put in place with the rest of the world in the intervening period, and so on? All that, it's a copy. I'm saying I can't answer your question because there are too many innumerable. I think, assuming that things don't change radically between now and then, which I think is unlikely, I think there will be a reluctance to go much beyond the things that Anna and Raoul have talked about, i.e. marginal improvements. Let's change the mood music first. Let's cooperate more openly on foreign policy, perhaps on security policy, justice and home affairs policies, as they're called in Brussels, and initially set up all sorts of task forces and committees and groups to look at where friction in trade can be reduced. And that will lead us into rules of origin and third-party accumulation and all the things that Anna has talked about. But if EEA is ruled out, if rejoining the customs union is ruled out, if full alignment on single market rules is ruled out, particularly if it includes free movement of people and workers, then it can't, the jagged edges of what the relationship is seen to have suffered so much that they really want to go back to the drawing board and start again, which is, I suppose, possible, but unlikely. There will be a lot of talk between now and then relationships about coming to terms with it, about rebuilding, particularly from the COVID crisis, on a different basis. I mean, a lot of the consequences of Brexit, we all know, are barely discernible yet because of the fog of COVID-19. Who knows quite what the trade data actually mean anymore? What is COVID and what is Brexit? Let's assume that in 3 or 4 years' time we do know, and that in part the Labour Party has won the election because the Conservative Party is not seen to have managed the process well. If that's the basis on which the election is won, then it becomes a matter of we're more competent. We have friends over there. We know how to talk to them better. We'll move away from antagonism, and we'll see where, with a better mood, but it's likely to be, I suppose, a rather cautious new Labour government, not a radical, unless of course, there's a total landslide, but it will not be a government wanting radical transformation of the relationship improvement.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. And finally, Luke, what are your thoughts on what you've heard as someone who's sort of actively campaigning in this area?
Yeah, well, I suppose I agree with Jonathan that there are clearly so many political contingencies that are up in the air here. It's very difficult to say what exactly the offer that Labour make in a 2023-2024 general election will be in light of all of those political contingencies around us. I do think that there are some certainties that we can at least say, is the current government, does it have a viable vision for Britain's economic and political future? And I would argue that they are stuck within really quite a big political and economic contradiction, that it should be the place of Labour to think over the next few years, how can that contradiction be exploited? And broadly, it's that they have a political communication strategy, which is all about levelling up. Boris Johnson, his point of reference is certainly doesn't seem to be Margaret Thatcher in the arguments that he puts forward. It's not aggressively individualistic. It doesn't. It's relaxed about things like public ownership in a way that Thatcher wasn't. It's redistributive in terms of the claims it makes around what the Tory government want to do and intend to do. Whether they deliver on it is another question, but in terms of the language, everyone will benefit from the Brexit dividend. This is very different from, say, Thatcher in 1982, her conference speech, for example, which he said something along the lines of, we will only achieve great things of Britain if we ask great things of Britain. And so those that work hard will be rewarded in the new economy. So I think Johnson is committed really to quite a post-Thatcherite agenda ideologically. And the question then is, does the trade relationship that he's seeking with the rest of the world, is that compatible with the political communication that he's pursuing? And I don't believe it is. I mean, if you look at Trans-Pacific partnership, I'm sure there will be different views on this on the panel, but someone like Joe Stiglitz, probably aligned pretty with a social democratic view of the world. He described it as the worst trade negotiation he believes has ever been negotiated in history. It's a very conventional free market trade agreement. And that suits a particular vision that Johnson would have, which is much more closely aligned to the Britannia Unchained deregulatory vision for Brexit. And I think the Australia trade deal raises similar considerations as a kind of gateway to the Trans-Pacific partnership. So sometimes when this is discussed in the media, I think some of the discussion, I don't know whether the trade experts on the panel will agree with this, but I'd be interested to hear what they think. Some of the discussion around GDP can be a bit unhelpful because the sectoral impact even can be really big, even though the actual GDP terms that are being discussed are small. Agriculture, just 0.6% of the UK economy. Steel, which stands, I think it's fair, already struggling, certainly stands to lose from the Trans-Pacific partnership and Australia as a segue into that, just 0.1% in GDP terms. But everyone in politics thinks that we need a steel industry. It employs 30,000 people, many of those people in seats that are in classic left behind Britain, post-Red Wall, new Blue Wall areas. So there is a kind of coherent agenda that Johnson could be pursuing, which would be more protectionist in this context, to try to render some of his some of his offer consistent with his trade policy. So I think it's incoherent. And then the second point I would make is, well, what would the Labour alternative be? And I'm very interested in whatever, making any small improvements that benefit British exporters. I think that they are particularly manufacturing exporters, I think, are the big losers from the huge non-tariff barriers that now exist with the European single market. So anything we can do to help them, to protect jobs. Obviously, I want to see the Labour Party pursuing all of those avenues, but I haven't heard anything tonight that would persuade me that the basic issue is, do you have freedom of movement and a kind of single market type relationship in order to get freedom of movement in order to access a closer economic relationship with the single market, or are you left with the kind of status quo? And I do think that there is a big danger that Boris Johnson's quite incoherent macroeconomic policy could just be politically accepted as a kind of fait accompli by the next Labour government, whenever that will be. And so it has this very strong sort of path dependent kind of quality. So I'm much more inclined to say, well, look, do we need to bite the bullet here? Do we need to say that we want dynamic regulatory alignment, a high regulation agenda, strong mobility rights for our citizens and a reciprocal arrangement on mobility? We don't have to call it freedom of movement. If we want to call it something else, I think the European Union would help us there in terms of coming up with language that helps us communicate it to the British electorate better. I think that that's the kind of offer that I would like to see Labour make, and I think it can be popular with a lot of voters. I mean, there are very few voters who have this SW1 vision of what Britannia Unchained kind of vision of what Brexit looks like. That's really quite a minority position in the electorate. Mostly voters want high regulation, high investment economy. Johnson's very effective political communication reflects their demands, but his policy doesn't. So it seems to me thinking fundamentally about how we can break open and exploit that contradiction is the big consideration for Labour.
Thank you for that. If I'm going to start by just asking a question that I have, a number of you have sort of touched on the question of free movement of people as a sort of base issue. I mean, to what extent, and maybe a question more for Jonathan, perhaps Raoul, I mean, to what extent do you think that there is scope for negotiating an arrangement with the EU that isn't quite free movement of people? One might call it free movement of people minus, in that it allows the UK and indeed the EU on the other side a certain amount of scope to restrict employment opportunities, maybe by reference to just preventing employment in key sectors, or alternatively some restriction on benefit entitlements, and perhaps an arrangement that wasn't under the under the supervision of the European Court of Justice, but had some other form of dispute resolution mechanism that might be seen as a bit less intrusive. To what extent do you think that some arrangement along those lines, that might be the way of dealing with, for example, issues about musicians and young people wanting to do temporary jobs on the continent or in London? What do you think, A, that that's something the EU would look at, and B, to what extent do you think it might, if that was the UK position, it might unlock other areas of cooperation?
Well, again, it depends on how bitter the relationship has become. If we assume it's not very bitter, then there are things that can be done. I agree entirely with those who say find different names, something different, explain them differently. The EU does that all the time. There will not be a deal for quotas of numbers of people who can go from one place to another. I think that is a step too far. There might be particular arrangements for certain categories of people. So young people moving around, of course, Europe will say, yes, rejoin Erasmus. We had a scheme for that. You were part of it. You benefited greatly. So did lots of our people. You can contribute to it financially. Your Turing scheme hasn't been a great success, assumption, hypothesis. Come back. We'll welcome you back into that. That's not impossible. Other particular groups of people, a special scheme for musicians, I know, call it the Hamburg scheme in honor of the Beatles or something. Just think there wouldn't have been, history would be so different without the Beatles stay in Hamburg. You might get a scheme like that off the ground. But you wouldn't get a wholesale reform unless the UK found allies among member states willing to do so, which it nearly did, could have done back in the period between 2010 and 2015, where free movement of people was controversial in many other countries in many different ways. Populist parties in Northern Europe, the French concerned about posted workers, the Central Eastern Europeans and Baltic states concerned about emigration of their able-bodied young people. You could then have had, this is an exam question I often pose to my students, it's all counterfactual history now. Could you have had in, say, 2014, 15, a great conference on the future of movement in Europe? Enlargement had happened. Europe was a very different place. The basic rules on free movement were all laid down in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Time to think again, what does free movement mean in the 21st century when countries which had been told for years you are facing demographic decline suddenly had a reversal. Demographic increases, you have to plan for infrastructure, for social infrastructure, for all these things. It's difficult in a sophisticated modern economy to cope with sudden changes in population size, upwards or downwards. So you could have had a great debate, but it never happened. The debate was tinged with racism. It became something a lot bigger than simply saying, let's look at the social security entitlement system. After all, the deal with the Cameron government in 2016 did do something about, or did offer something about phasing in rights to social security equality. I know a lot of people said the Court of Justice will never uphold it. It's not worth the paper it's written on, to which the other said, well, whatever we did, you'd have said that anyway. The politics are tough, were tough, but I think we've gone beyond that. So unless there is another crisis in which the UK finds allies among the member states, and don't forget all Britain's erstwhile friends, the members of coalitions the UK led as a member state, have watched the spectacle of how Brexit has played out so far. So while you might have thought that the Danes and the Dutch and others might have had some sympathy, and there was a great fear in Brussels of contagion, that fear, for the time being, nothing should be taken for granted, has been put to one side. Who knows what the situation will look like when the new Labour government takes power? But unless it's very different from today, again, I think we should look at specific sectors on which changes might be necessary or appropriate or agreeable, rather than going back to ideas of radical change.
I'll just to add to that. I mean, I agree with a lot of that. I think I'm quite skeptical about doing, variations on freedom of movement. I think Jonathan's point about building allies is probably true, but I think that's very hard to do from outside as a non-member state anymore, and particularly with the UK having been outside for a while by this hypothetical point in time. I also think, trying to badge it in a way, yes, the EU does that, but it doesn't always work, and I think voters are, trying to maintain that line and get it past voters is always very difficult. And I think, in my experience, to be honest, if the EU were to get a win, like sort of see it as a win in their eyes of getting free movement back, but calling it something else and the UK agreeing, that would be very quickly leaked out to the press and shown as an EU win, and then it would be in the UK press and it would all get quite messy. So I think we're, trying to sort of slide that in through a different name is still going to be difficult. And I think just on Luke's point about incoherence, I would just say as well, I think voters, there's been recent polling on this. Yes, there is incoherence to the policy, but do voters care about that? It's not clear they do, and voters often quite have incoherent views themselves as well. So I think the context of that kind of stuff matters. But of course, the immigration context is going to be pretty different in 2025 as well. What does the labour market in the UK look like? So, what the views on immigration will be then and what the voters will think is also going to be different. So that context will need to be taken into account. But I think on the whole, I'm personally quite sceptical of there being much in terms of tweaks to freedom of movement beyond just accepting it essentially wholesale. And again, the Swiss precedent is there, looming large, particularly given what we've seen in the past few months with Switzerland walking away from the framework negotiations. I don't know where it will be in 2025, etc. But if they were to offer us something like this, it would be very hard for them not to offer it to the Swiss as well.
I put a question asked by Lucy Anderson on data protection, maybe for Raoul or again for Jonathan, but I'll throw it at Raoul. And she asked, how far will the likely watering down of UK data protection rights and divergence on laws dealing with online platforms be a hurdle for constructive discussions with the EU in 2025? I mean, obviously, data protection links into all sorts of areas of possible cooperation. So anyway, Raoul, what have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, again, very hypothetical. If that were to happen, and if the UK were to have, if an adequacy agreement does happen in the next few weeks, and then it is removed or not renewed after a certain amount of time because of divergence, then I think it would be a difficult place, particularly for the security relationship and for some services trade. I think the exchange of personal data in those areas is very important. It's not, obviously, not having adequacy and having divergence, it doesn't necessarily mean it can't happen. A lot of firms in the run up to the end of the transition period were putting in place, standard contractual clauses and other mechanisms to manage this. It just becomes complicated and costly, and the volume of paperwork expands quite a lot over time. So it's not impossible. I do think the main area of harm would be in the security, justice, and home affairs space. If you don't have a data adequacy and trust in each other's data protection, then that really puts a limit on the level of cooperation in that space. That would be my main thought.
Anyone else on the panel have thoughts on that?
I mean, just a simple one. I mean, if there has been what Brussels sees as backsliding, it will ask a new British government to promise to upslide, or whatever the opposite of backslide is, and not do it again. Now, I'm not sure that's very helpful, but that's the obvious reaction.
Yeah. Another question from Lucy on question dear to all lawyers' hearts. Will there be a sensible approach to negotiating a replacement for the loss of reciprocal rules on jurisdiction and enforcement on civil cases? And she asked, why is that not a priority for the EU? I mean, again, I think probably for either Raoul or Jonathan, if you want any thoughts on that. I'm not sure, Raoul, to what extent that was being discussed when you were involved in the discussions between the UK and the EU. It's obviously always been a UK concern.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was discussed a bit when I was involved, but it was sort of parked as an issue for the future. So, we could tell the EU were quite hostile to our ask in that space, and we're not particularly keen on continuing Legano and allowing our continued membership of that. But I think they it never really came to a head in any concrete way because we didn't get onto that detailed negotiation. I mean, I think, again, look, maybe this is something that over time, if tensions simmer down and the environment on both sides is better, there's more trust, you could see a change in position, and the EU willing to review it, build a relationship in this space and possibly let the UK rejoin the Legano convention. But I mean, again, this feels to me like, similar to financial services, a bit of a strategic play on the EU's part. There's a part of the EU view that I think just doesn't want the UK to be the sort of legal centre in some ways for some aspects of EU business. So I think there is an element of that as well. So I don't think that they're guaranteed. And then finally, I guess they just see it as an offensive ask from the UK. So the question is, what do they get in return for agreeing to it as well? So that's sort of basic negotiating instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, there is, of course, at least to some extent, an EU interest in the UK being part of the Brussels and Rome regimes. There are EU companies with significant business interests in the United Kingdom, and it isn't in the interests of big EU companies to have to deal with complexities of jurisdiction and parallel litigation in 2 fora rather than 1. So there is, to that extent, an EU interest in getting a deal done. It's not wholly an offensive ask by the UK, but Jonathan's shaking his head on that.
Well, I just don't think that, I mean, that argument is absolutely right and sensible, to use Lucy's word, but it doesn't get through. This is decided by Justice Ministry officials, and they think this is something the UK wants. Plus, it reminds them of all their ancestral arguments about the merits of the civil law against the common law, and they've got rid of the pesky big common law country. And this is something the UK wants because British legal services are a big export. So what are you going to pay for it, they'll say.
Yeah. Ask something about a question I have. Again, anyone, members of the audience, do ask further questions if you want to. Question about dispute resolution mechanism. I mean, one idea that was being floated quite a lot at the time of the discussions between the EU and the UK during the May government broadly was the idea that instead of what's sometimes called the Ukraine, this is really sort of deal with areas where the UK decides to align with EU law, instead of what's sometimes called the Ukraine model of having arbitration panels with references to the ECJ when points of EU law arose, one might dock to the EFTA court with the possibility as well that that might involve in those cases a UK judge sitting with the EFTA 3. I mean, again, probably a question again, I'm afraid, for Raoul and Jonathan, is that an idea that you think would ever in any circumstances get any traction with the EU or indeed with the EEA, since it's their court?
So you're right, it was something that came up, and I did look at this. I don't think it was anything that the May government ever seriously considered. I think there were two issues. that I saw in it. One is obviously if you don't want ECJ jurisdiction in the EFTA court when it really comes to the relevant rulings on any EU law or EU rules or alignment of rules, they follow the ECJ essentially, So I think it doesn't solve that issue, but if you're happy with that, then that's okay. I think the second issue is sort of what you touched upon is I think actually some of the EEA members would not be very happy with it. They've got a system that works, and the UK is so disproportionately large relative to the other EEA members, wading into their club and messing it up in a way and changing the entire balance within it, I think would actually be quite difficult for them. I think if the UK and EU wanted to do it, they would obviously, I think go along with it, but I don't think they would be particularly happy. And they were always pretty cautious about that. So, and I think the EU would probably say, well, they would rather it would be the ECJ. I think if you don't mind following the ECJ, which, as I said, you end up kind of doing with EFTA, then why not just have the ECJ? So I think that would probably be the EU view, but Jonathan might know better. But yeah, it's possible. I think it would just be a bit messier than people think in terms of having to rewrite a lot of the EFTA court rules, the way the EA works, and things like that. It would become quite complicated.
Could I say something before, Jonathan?
Please,
please.
I've talked far too much.
No, it's just because it's more of a question, really. But I, in terms of what you described as the when we were discussing this conversation beforehand, the science fiction of it, it does seem to me that, or do you agree that the EU side using the level playing field provisions in the existing agreement, so activating the existing dispute mechanism in relation to environmental regulation, it seems quite likely, if that's obviously an area where the UK in the past has lost quite a few ECJ cases. So if it sees the UK as undercutting EU environmental laws over the next few years, is there a sort of scope for this to become sort of part of the kind of way in which this is being contested in British politics? And then I think was George also, your question was not necessarily about joining EFTA, but also the possibility of innovating, so creating an EFTA-like body that was maybe unique, but still had some reference to the ECJ acquis communautaire EU body of law.
I mean, if there has been a row about British deregulation or underregulation, then a new Labour government which says, yes, we acknowledge that, and we didn't want it either, we voted against it, and we believe that the UK is a modern European state as well. We're not rejoining your organization, but we share the same values, fundamental rights, environment, etc., and we want to work with you to restore the trust that the former government has spurned. That sort of thing might get off the ground. If you then lock lawyers in a room, they might come up with something like Ukraine. I wouldn't mention Ukraine because the problem is that anything, as Raoul said, anything which could immediately be, I'm assuming this is not in our science fiction, this is not a 1945 landslide. This is an outright majority, but there is still a substantial conservative opposition in the House of Commons. They, of course, will scream blue murder that this is a sellout, treason, there'll be litigation, Munich, Brexit through the back door, and so on. It will have to be a very brave government to pursue that course of action, even in a relatively minor way. That's what we're up against. Unless the British economy, and I hope this in any way at all, of course, has tanked so badly that there is a pervasive sense of crisis in the country that we've got to do something radically different. Assuming that is not the case, then the government of the day will have to tread carefully, and we'll have to rebuild confidence gradually. So there are things people will say, we'll leave that to a second term, we'll talk about it, but we're not ready to go there yet. But we will pledge to review, upgrade our standards. We're not seeking to undercut our continental friends. We want financial stability, and we want responsible climate policies and all the rest of it in the way they do, and we will correct the mistakes made by our predecessors. Probably you can't hope for more than that.
Right. Any further comments on that? Yeah. So I think, well, another question on audiovisual and digital services. I think is it Raoul, Jonathan, do you think that is simply not an area? Again, it's an area that might be classed as such a UK ask that it's simply not something that the EU would be willing to concede without a fairly major concession by the UK.
Yeah. I mean, I think
yes.
I think unless you're doing EA, audiovisuals off the table essentially.
Yeah. Don't forget both to pick up a point Luke made earlier, it's perfectly possible that both the EU and the UK will be pursuing a sort of Gaullist, protectionist, the right stealing the clothes of the left policy. In fact, the UK will be behaving in a rather similar way to the way the EU behaves. The EU has bigger scale, frankly, is more likely to be able to pull it off, but that's another story. But the opportunities for antagonism and rows and banning your company taking over my company are endless.
Yes. I mean, returning to the topic of mobility, I mean, one issue that, to some people's amusement, has got a certain amount of purchase in some of the right-wing press is the position of UK people, particularly retired people, who've got used to living in Spain or the Mediterranean for the whole summer, and suddenly discover there's this 90-day out of every 180 rule that the Schengen zone has. I've certainly heard it said that 90 out of 180-day rule is really pretty immutable as far as the Schengen countries are concerned. I mean, do you think that's right, or do you think there's any scope for devising something a little bit more flexible for what is a very large and, for practical purposes, equally prosperous neighbour? We're not across an ocean, and we're not a country like Russia in a very different economic position. We are a bit sui generis. Do you think there's any scope for a sui generis rule for UK citizens?
With enormous goodwill and everybody getting on very well together, wanting to rebuild. I mean, these are not people, the numbers aren't very large, but they actually contribute quite a lot to the economies of the regions in which they have settled. I'm talking about British expats with second homes. You may get some deal for second home owners in agreement with the local authorities. I mean, the Schengen rules themselves, no, they are pretty unchangeable, I think, by now. But you might get some local flexibility, agreed.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's in the same category as students and au pairs and budding pop stars and sports people and so on.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm conscious of the time. It is now 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in Brussels, and we thought we'd sort of bring it to an end after about an hour. I don't see any further questions coming up on the chat. So I think all that remains for me to do is to thank all of our panel, Jonathan and Anna and Raoul and Luke, for what's been a very interesting evening. And thanks to all of you for attending. Goodbye, everybody.